Hi, and welcome to Why Do Countries Exist, an episode on New Zealand political parties. So today's episode was requested by Spaceflare on YouTube. If you want me to do another country's political parties, you can either comment it down below, send me an email, or put a request in the request form in the description. I currently have requests to do Brazilian parties, Nigerian parties, Irish parties, Polish parties, Danish parties, Japanese parties, Greek parties, Chilean parties, German parties, Turkish parties, and many more. Also, I'd like to give a big shout out to Chris Nixon. He has offered to look over my script and put me in the direction of some good sources for studying New Zealand politics. He also is a civil servant and apparently worked in New Zealand's parliament, so I guess I have some fans in high places. So New Zealand, like many countries, is not a homogenous nation, with many divides and different people in the country. One very important group of people are the indigenous Māori people, who today make up a little over 15% of the country. The Māori, along with the first European colonists who arrived in the country in the 19th century, greatly shaped the development of the country. In 1840, Maori chiefs and the British colonial government signed the Treaty of Waitangi. The treaty essentially gave British citizenship to the Maori, and controversially, depending on the translation, either gave the Maori sovereignty and control of their land, or gave the British Crown sovereignty and allowed the Crown a certain degree of control over all land in the country. The short version of why this is important is because this treaty helped shape the future of race relations and political development in New Zealand, is often used and cited by Maori activists when pushing for greater change for their communities, and when looking at New Zealand politics, you will see it comes up very often, and many political parties will have at least a section on their policies page discussing it. New Zealand's parliament has a single chamber, the House of Representatives. The House is made up of 120 MPs who are elected from three separate ways. First, there is the electorate vote. This vote is divided between the general electorate, which is where the non-Maori vote, and the Maori electorate, which is where everyone on the Maori roll vote. The general electorate has 65 MPs, being divided among 65 electorates found throughout the country. Whoever wins the most votes in the electorate vote gets to become that electorate's MP. It's a similar story in the Maori electorates. There are 7 Maori electorate MPs, who are divided into 7 different Maori electorates found throughout the country. And again, whoever gets the most votes becomes that electorate's MP. Finally, there are the remaining 48 seats, who are elected from the party vote. The party vote allows New Zealanders to vote for just political parties, and any party that gets above 5% of the vote, or wins at least one electorate seat, can get seats from the party vote. Parliament will elect the Prime Minister, the most powerful political figure in the country, and vote on rules and regulations. Also important to note is that New Zealand is also a part of the Commonwealth, and has a Governor-General who serves as the Queen of England's representative. Before we begin talking about the parties of New Zealand, I thought I'd go over some of the resources Chris sent me, just in case you want some more context. So first off, there is a series on YouTube called The Citizen's Handbook, and it goes over some of the history of New Zealand, and broadly explains several political structures in the country. Each episode is pretty short, and is very John Oliver-esque with its jokes and editing style, so if you like those kind of shows, and want a quick overview on several important topics in New Zealand, I would recommend watching it. Secondly, he also recommends the documentary Campaign, that goes over the 1996 election in the electorate of Wilmington Central. It goes through several candidates in their campaign to get elected, and while it doesn't give a lot of commentary or post-election analysis, it does give a nice snapshot of what politics was like back then, and can also help explain how MMP operates in the country. Finally, and probably my favorite, is the TV miniseries Revolution. It goes over New Zealand's change from the late 70s to the early 90s that saw neoliberal reforms occur, which were often described as Rogernomics, named after the Minister of Finance at the time. I thought it was super fascinating and really interesting. Ironically, a lot of the free market reforms were actually carried out initially by the country's main center-left party, whereas most other parts of the world, you had right-wing conservatives like Ronald Reagan or Margaret Thatcher carry them out. I will put a link to all 3 of these resources in the description. And speaking of the country's main center-left party, we have the Labour Party of New Zealand, or Ropu Repa o Oaite Arawa. The Labour Party is a broad social democratic party and has been running the country since 2017, with it defining itself as leading a, quote, new and progressive movement. The Labour Party, like most center-left parties, is divided between its more moderate and centrist wing and its more socialist and idealistic wing, But this seems to be a relatively small divide with not a whole lot of infighting. When the party was originally founded, it was a party representing Marxist and trade unionists, but since its first government in the 1930s, it has moderated quite a bit. Its support base today tends to be centered in urban areas and to a certain extent in the suburbs, and generally gets support among those in trade unions, pensioners, ethnic minorities, and Māori. They currently have 65 MPs in Parliament. The party is currently headed by Jacinda Ardern, an MP from Auckland and the current Prime Minister of the country. Labour under Ardern has been focused more on pursuing progressive social policies. It wants to ensure more jobs and greater representation for all minorities in New Zealand, wants to do more to ensure the Treaty of Waitangi is being upheld, and wants to reduce disparities between the Māori and the non-Māori population, wants to do more to make New Zealand sustainable, and wants to remove all forms of hate and discrimination in New Zealand. The Labour Party also favours generally interventionist policies. It wants to invest more in infrastructure, wants to create more jobs, wants to build more public housing, wants to increase taxes on big businesses, especially foreign ones, and generally favours granting greater powers to unions. They also favour strict gun control, wants to work more with Pacific and EU countries, and wants to improve access to mental health facilities across the country. Ardern is a pretty popular politician, especially early into her prime ministership, when the news outlets talked of Jacinda mania, and was miles ahead of everyone else in opinion polls. However, Labour is certainly not free from criticism. Those right of Labour see them as wasteful spenders and incompetent administrators, while those left of them see them as too centrist, at fault for a lot of the negative consequences of Rogernomics, and unwilling to push for real change. Ardern herself has received more criticism in recent months, especially as the cost of living has gone up dramatically, inflation has increased, and people are accusing the Labour Party of virtue signaling. Labour may talk a lot about pushing for progressive policy and ensuring everyone has a seat at the table, but they are sometimes seen as just saying things for good press. There also is a sense that outside the leadership of the party and its high-ranking members, a lot of its MPs and politicians are just not that spectacular. Labour is currently in government with the Green Party of Aotearoa, New Zealand, or Ropu Kakariki o Aotearoa New Tarini. The Green Party is, unsurprisingly, an environmentalist party, pushing for more environmental policies and sitting to the left of Labour. They've generally tend to, although not always, back Labour, and generally support Labour governments. They, until the 90s, were a pretty fringe party until proportional representation was implemented, and they are now often the third or fourth largest party in the country at any point. They tend to be backed largely by young people in urban areas, particularly in Auckland and Wellington. It has 10 MPs. It is currently headed by James Shaw, an MP and Minister for Climate Change, and Marama Davidson, another MP and Minister for Prevention of Family and Sexual Violence. The Greens' major focus is on the environment. It wants to prevent unsustainable practices in the ocean, reducing New Zealand's impact on the oceans, improving water quality, wants to transition New Zealand to a circular no-waste economy, opposes animal testing, and wants to promote public transport while investing more in rapid rail. They also are socially progressive, like the Labour Party, wanting to adhere strictly to the Treaty of Waitangi, wants to lower the voting age to 16, wants to increase the number of refugees New Zealand accepts, and wants to fight for greater rights for LGBTQ people and Pacific Islanders in the country and improve their conditions. They also favor progressive taxes, oppose artificial fertilizers, wants to make the housing market more affordable, and supports self-determination for West Papua, Western Sahara, and Palestine. The Greens, while currently in a government with Labour, there is seemingly some tension between the two. For example, on the 8th, Shaw, as the Minister for Climate, when asked about a bill that would reduce agricultural emissions, both critiqued the bill, which Labour supported, but also refused to outright condemn or support it. This points to the fact that the Greens, as a junior partner in the coalition, can influence Labour but are still beholden to them. The Greens are sometimes accused of just being useful idiots to Labour, backing up and supporting whatever Labour does at the end of the day. The Greens are also accused of just being made up of a bunch of hippies and yuppies who are, quote, unrealistic. So that was the government, and we will now move on to the opposition. The largest opposition party, and the main rival to Labour, is the New Zealand National Party, or Ropu Nahinara o Aotearoa, or the Nats. The Nats are a broad centre-right party, representing conservatives, right-wing liberals, and centrists opposed to Labour. It was founded as a collection of all the right-wing anti-Labour forces in the 1930s, and since then has run the country off and on until today. It generally does best in rural areas, but can hold its own in some of the suburbs of Auckland, and its supporters tend to be older, make more money, and are more likely to be white, but also a significant chunk of its support base is Chinese. It currently has 32 MPs. It is currently headed by Christopher Luxon, an MP from Auckland, and the leader of the opposition. The Nats believe generally in free market economics and support a small government. It has on its value page a quote that states that, quote, by the development of the private citizen expressing his or her fullest freedom and responsibility, that any state becomes great. So this means that the party wants to ensure that taxes remain low, there is less regulation, private property is respected, and supports a limited welfare state. They tend to lean socially conservative, such as wanting a stronger police force, believe in more tough-on-crime policy, and oppose the legalization of marijuana. However, they also on their website talk of helping streamline the process of immigrating to New Zealand, especially for skilled workers, and wants to increase the strength Maori owners have over their traditional land. They tend to favor better relations with China and America, and Luxon wants to crack down on human trafficking. The National Party is currently rising in the polls, and is right now polling above Labour. But, like Labour, there are quite a few reasons people dislike or distrust the Nats. Generally, those right of them see them as too moderate, unwilling to oppose Labour's policies, while those left of them see them as serving the interest of big businesses, and those well off while ignoring the poor and disadvantaged. The Nats also have suffered from some infighting over the past couple years, as the more moderate wing of the party and the more conservative wing of the party has both attempted to push the party in two different directions. The more moderate liberal wing seems to be mostly dominant, and this could lead those on the right to join other alternative right-wing forces, although most right-wing alternatives to Nationals seem to be fairly small. Also, just briefly, I want to say it's pretty shocking how unappealing the National Party is to Maori. Since National was founded in 1936, the Nats have won a grand total of 1 seat from the Maori electorates ever. But also, interestingly enough, between National and Labour, National is the only one to have had a Maori leader, Simon Bridges. While most right-wing alternatives to the National Party are pretty small and fringe, there is one successful right-wing alternative, Association for Consumers and Taxpayers, or ACT New Zealand. ACT traditionally has been seen as a libertarian party, embracing the neoliberal reform New Zealand experience in the 80s, and generally leaning towards less government in social and economic affairs. It had a small but decent chunk of the vote from 1996 until 2005, when it dropped in support and remained as a small force in parliament, but never getting over 4% of the vote. It was seen only as existing as an ally of the National Party due to an electoral agreement. However, in the latest election, it began to embrace more populist and anti-establishment themes, and rose in support, getting its best showing ever and holding a decent chunk of parliament. It today has a pretty similar support base to National, mostly white, rural, and rich, although the party is seen as being younger than the Nationals. It currently has 10 MPs. It is currently led by David Seymour, an MP from Auckland. ACT's libertarian origins certainly are present when looking at their policies they advocate for, which is often less government. They back gun rights, support legalizing euthanasia, are opposed to COVID restrictions, oppose raising the minimum wage, oppose banning hate speech, wants welfare to be time-limited for most people, believes free market solutions should be favored over government regulation and conservation, is hostile towards income taxes, preferring a flat tax, and is supportive of free trade. However, they do have a slight socially conservative streak. This includes introducing more law and order style policies to do with gangs in the country, is supportive of the Five Eyes program, and its supporters tend to want to abolish the Maori electorates. It also is strongly hostile towards the CCP, seemingly recognizes Taiwan as a country, favors transitioning New Zealand towards a 4-year term with greater power to opposition parties in parliament, and favors more deregulations on the housing market. ACT is sort of seen as similar-ish to the Greens, just in the sense that they are tied to a larger political party, and are accused of just being useful idiots for the National Party. Although ACT has been trying to distance itself from National. ACT suffers from a lot of the same problems National can suffer from, being seen as a party for the rich, not caring about disadvantaged groups, and there is some tension in the party. The tension in ACT, however, is a bit more along the traditional classical liberal old guard that has historically made up the party, and its newer, more radical anti-establishment support base. While right now the party seems unified, if Seymour were to lose his popularity among the rank and file, the party could experience infighting. Seymour also has been accused of using fear-mongering and demagoguery to attract support, and of being the only really notable member in the party. The last party I'll go in depth in is the Māori Party, or Te Pāti Māori. The Māori Party, unsurprisingly, is very focused on Māori issues, wanting greater self-determination for the Maori community and for the Treaty of Waitangi to be respected. It was originally founded as a break-off of the Labour Party, after it felt like the Labour government was undermining the Treaty of Waitangi and the rights of the Maori. It tends to sit between Labour and the National Party, supporting the national government from 2008 to 2017, and today seems to be leaning more towards Labour. Its support base seems to be mostly uniform across the Māori community, but with more support on the eastern side of the North Island. It currently has 2 MPs, with both of its MPs serving as co-leaders for the party. There is the male leader, Raui Waititi, and the female leader, Debbie Ngari-Wapaka. The Māori Party argues that, quote, Indigenous solutions can help unlock the well-being of our whānau, or roughly family, and our nation. The party wants to invest more in the Māori community, wants to grant more land control to the Māori iwi, or tribe, wants to ban seabed mining, and wants to remove the GST tax from all food sales. It seeks to promote the Maori language, Te Reo Māori, and change New Zealand's name officially to Aotearoa, the traditional Maori name for the country. It also wants to create a separate Maori parliament, wants to reduce the electoral threshold to 2.5%, and remove New Zealand from the Commonwealth and establish the country as a republic. The Māori's party position between Labour and National means that they can play kingmaker and decide which party gets to govern the country. However, this requires a perfect storm of events, and if they aren't able to position themselves into government as a needed ally, then due to their small size, they don't really hold a lot of influence. Even when the Māori Party gets to play kingmaker, there are problems. For example, after backing the national government in the 2000s, the party saw a loss of support election on election, until eventually losing all of its seats in 2017. If the Māori Party sides with either of the 2 major parties and is forced to compromise, they can be seen by Maori activists as failing to uphold the interest of their community and lead to a loss of support for the party. So those are all the parties that are present in Parliament. However, Chris recommended I talk about New Zealand first, so I figured I'd just briefly go over NZ first and a couple other minor parties that may become relevant in the future. So first off, NZ First is a populist, quasi-nationalist party formed around Winston Peters. Peters has been involved in New Zealand politics since the 70s. While initially involved in the National Party, he formed NZ First in 1993 and has served as an important kingmaker in New Zealand politics, with Peters being given the role of Deputy Prime Minister from 2017 to 2020. The party tends to argue along nationalist lines of putting New Zealanders first and opposing the political establishment. The party is generally more left-wing on economics, but also more right-wing on social issues. It generally is supported by older voters and those in the far north of the country. Similar to the Māori Party, playing kingmaker has its drawbacks, and in 2020 it lost all its seats, seemingly due to the party losing its populist street cred. There is a chance that the party will come back, as a similar scenario happened in 2008, but at least right now, polls aren't showing any rise in the party. Next, we'll go over to the Opportunities Party, or TOP. TOP is a centrist party that stands for, quote, evidence-based policies. It seems like it wants tougher action on climate change, supports universal basic income, wants tougher restrictions on alcohol, democratic reform, and more urban development. The party was founded in 2016, and has attempted to push for its pragmatic version of New Zealand since. However, TOP has never entered Parliament, and I sorta get the sense that nobody is really thinking about them. It gets most support in urban areas, particularly in the capital Wellington, along with some of the language it uses on its website, leads me to suspect that it's a party for the worst type of people, political science majors. Political scientists tend to be viewed as sort of elitist nerds who can't really appeal to the common people, so if my theory that it is a party for poli-sci people, then it's not a surprise that they are where they are. I do think it is possible for them to maybe win an electorate in Wilmington, but I suspect it's probably a bit of a long shot and it would require a perfect storm of events. Finally, the last party I will talk about is the New Conservative Party, the last party that got more party votes than the Māori Party, but still got no seats. The New Conservatives are, unsurprisingly, conservative, and represent a more right-wing alternative to the National Party. They have campaigned on protecting the nuclear family, opposing further LGBTQ rights, supporting free speech, and fighting for the right in the culture war. They did better last election in rural areas, and a lot of their supporters seem to be very loud and vocal online. Most news outlets have labeled them as far-right and indulging in conspiracy theories, although they are apparently attempting to tone down their message. I think that even if they do, the fact that culture war issues and rhetoric are so prominent in their messages, it will likely mean that most New Zealanders, who seem to be fairly moderate ideologically, will probably be turned off by the party. I do think that there is a world where the New Conservatives or some other hard-right party does actually get some seats in Parliament, but I think it would require both the National Party and ACT to become deeply unpopular with their right-wing support base. It's not impossible for this to happen, but I suspect it won't happen next election. So those are the parties of New Zealand. Again, thanks to Chris so much for helping me out. I really appreciate it, and I love the resources that he sent me. In summary, we have Labour on the left and the National Party on the right, representing the two main political parties. Then we have the Greens, who serve as a left-wing ally of Labour, ACT as a right-wing ally/alternative to the National Party, and finally the Māori Party representing Maori interest. And there's also some small minor parties, so yeah. Thanks for watching, thanks for listening. Up next, I will talk about the primaries that are coming up in my home state, Washington. As a small side note, I think it's very interesting that in New Zealand politics, American politics are brought up frequently as this evil looming specter that the New Zealand political elite fears will happen to them one day. You can interpret that as you will. And then after that, I will work on the history of Cambodia. And then after that, sort of depending on the time, I will either work on Brazilian political parties or Nigerian political parties. So yeah, thanks for listening. If you want, you can email me at whydocountries@gmail.com for your thoughts, comments, suggestions, or hate mail. Take care. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.